Can I say, first of all, thanks to everybody for turning out in such huge numbers to commemorate, I suppose, in many ways, one of the most momentous decisions taken in the course of Irish politics in the last century. It was 20 years ago today, the IRA announced its total cessation of military activities. That unilateral initiative by the IRA leadership broke the cycle of conflict in this country and opened up new and challenging possibilities. At that time, as history will record, there were parallel processes in place. I was charged with the responsibility on behalf of the leadership of Sinn Féin and with the support of the IRA to open up an engagement with representatives of the British government. And that we did. I was assisted in that project by Jerry Kelly in Belfast. Parallel to that was the Gerry Adams, John Hume discussions, supported by the incredible Father Alec Reid. We quickly came to the conclusions that the engagement with the British government wasn't going to lead anywhere, but that more store could be placed in the dialogue that was taking place between Gerry Adams, John Hume, with the support of Albert Reynolds, Irish America, and many others who were intrigued at the prospect of peace in Ireland. So the IRA decision came out of those discussions, not out of any back-channel discussions with the British government. In fact, during the course of the back-channel discussions, and it's well recorded in our paper of setting that card straight whenever Patrick Mayhew had to go into the British House of Commons and make dozens of corrections to statements that he made. But during that process, the British government showed itself to be interested only in private discussions with the Sinn Féin leadership in places like Scandinavia and Scotland. And of course, when the IRA did during that period called a short-term ceasefire, the British government ran away from its own proposal. In fact, the short-term ceasefire was a proposal that they had made. But whenever the IRA said that they would do it, no discussions took place, and effectively our focus then turned to the Hume, Adams, Alec Reid dialogue. And as a result of that, the IRA made their decision. And that decision was one of the most momentous in the politics of this island, as I said, in the last century. We are conscious of the vicious cycle of conflict that existed, and of the fact that it took many lives, the lives of many of our friends, many Republicans, IRA volunteers, many members of British state forces, and our opponents and civilians caught up in the conflict. So I think it is important to remember, without exception, everyone, all of them, who lost their lives in that conflict, that we remember them today. But the subsequent success of the peace process and the transformation of politics across this island and between this island and Britain that flowed from that courageous initiative in 1994 were not assured of success. It wasn't a given. Real efforts and commitment, courage and determination, and the personal engagement of key political players all played a crucial part. As I said, the dialogue between Gerry Adams and John Hume was the starting point for what became the Irish peace process. But many others played a part. In particular, Father Alec Reid. He laboured tirelessly at a time of exclusion and censorship to uphold and promote dialogue. At the start of this week, we buried Albert Reynolds, Taoiseach at the time of the cessation in 1994. Albert played a key role in laying the essential groundwork for that initiative. He personally discarded the failed and disgraceful policy of isolation, censorship and repression that the traditional response of the Irish establishment was to the conflict in the north. The abandonment of Northern nationalists by successive Irish governments to the excesses of the Orange state was one of the key drivers of the conflict in the North. Albert Reynolds changed that policy and authorised direct discussions between his office and Sinn Féin. And it was his courage in taking this step, I believe, that sets Albert apart. I was very pleased to meet John Major during the course of Albert's funeral. I had met him previously, just for a fleeting moment, at Nelson Mandela's funeral last year. But I think it is important to record, particularly in the context of the failure of David Cameron during 4 years as British Prime Minister, not to meet with the Sinn Féin leadership. Also important to record that in the aftermath of the IRA cessation of 1994, and until Tony Blair came in as British Prime Minister in 1997, and I was elected for the first time as an MP representing the Mid-Ulster constituency, Sinn Féin leadership had never met John Major either. So I think that's what sets Albert apart. So also with Tony Blair and President Clinton, who challenged those who were wedded to the failed policies of isolation and repression. The collective efforts of these people, senior political leaders, and ordinary citizens led ultimately to the transformation of the political landscape on this island. And despite the ongoing difficulties, no one should gainsay or underestimate the progress which has been achieved, especially given the ongoing conflicts elsewhere in the world. Despite our obvious political differences, I want to commend today all those involved in our successful peace process, from all parties and none. Dialogue was the key to progress in Ireland. It is a key to progress today, and the alternative to terrible conflict in Gaza, in Syria, in Africa, in Iraq, and in the Ukraine. As Irish Republicans, we entered the early stages of the peace process with the deepest and, I think, healthiest scepticism about British intentions. However, the outworking of our strategy did result in the Good Friday Agreement. That agreement, supported by the vast majority of the Irish people, has removed any rationale for armed struggle and have put in place peaceful and democratic alternatives. In 1994, dialogue offered the only way out of perpetual conflict, and Irish Republicans entered that dialogue with confidence. I would urge anti-peace process Republicans still committed to armed actions today to take the same step in 2014 into politics and away from conflict. There can be no return to the violence and repression that scarred this society for far too long. A commitment to dialogue and the confidence to enter that dialogue as Irish Republicans, but with a willingness to listen to the perspectives of others, are critically important elements in the progress that we have made so far. And the absence of dialogue and a commitment to dialogue as a way to overcome disagreements is at the heart of the growing difficulties we are now facing in the peace process across a range of issues. The deterioration in political relationships has its origins in the inability of unionist leaders to accept and to come to terms with a democratic decision taken by Belfast City Councillors. The decision to restrict the flying of the Union flag to designated days is, of course, a compromise position, a compromise which Sinn Féin was prepared to support. But the Unionist parties have been incapable of accepting this compromise and have railed against what was a democratic decision. And it is that failure, the failure to accept the democratic decision, the failure to work towards compromise, the rejection of dialogue and negotiations to resolve contentious issues, which is now at the heart of the problems that we are facing. Rather than making progress on the issues of identity, parading in the past, by building on the enormously important work carried out by Richard Haass and Meghan O'Sullivan, The DUP and the Ulster Unionists have now retreated into a coalition with rejectionist unionism and with loyalist paramilitaries. This coalition of unionism and loyalism around negative politics has its origins in the anti-democratic protests and violence which we saw on the streets of Belfast that followed the decision of Belfast City Council to change the policy of flying the Union flag every day of the year. Political unionism has walked away from dialogue and has now adopted the Orange Order's position of setting down preconditions and predetermined outcomes for any discussions. The failure of the Orange Order to enter a process of meaningful engagement with the local community in Ardoyne is now mirrored in the politics and make-up of the pan-unionist coalition. Dialogue is now contingent on an Orange March being allowed to parade through a nationalist area of North Belfast. And the rejection of dialogue and negotiations has spread like a virus to all other issues, including those already agreed and which are commitments in the programme for government, such as the development of the Maze Long Kesh site. Similarly, with the issue of welfare cuts, the DUP position is that because they have accepted the anti-poor agenda of the Tory millionaires in London, we should all accept cuts to the income of the most vulnerable in our society, which the British government are trying to impose on our executive and which is no part of our agreed programme for government. And let me be absolutely clear, Sinn Féin is totally opposed to the Tory welfare reform programme because it is a right-wing, ideologically driven attack on the poorest and most vulnerable in our society. It's also very interesting that during the course of the debate with Alex Salmon, Alistair Darling, on behalf of the Labour Party, said that he too was opposed to the welfare cuts that the Tories were attempting to introduce. And I hope the Labour Party endorses that position and holds to it in the time ahead. Why? Because these welfare cuts would undermine the rights and entitlements of many within the unionist and loyalist communities, and whole families will be plunged into deeper poverty through reduced support and cuts to their benefit payments. And of course, the British government have flagged up, even in the aftermath of the initial cuts that they intend to impose, that there are more cuts coming down the tracks. George Osborne raised a figure of something like 12 billion more. And of course, they fed the media in recent times that child benefit would be restricted to 4 children within any family if they get their way. So I think all of this needs to be kept in a proper perspective. We see in England the increase in food banks. We see the privatisation of authorising people who are on disability to continue with their disability or to be cut, and a whole range of other measures which are absolutely directed at the poorest, most marginalised and most disabled within our society. Also, we've seen in the last 6 months, on 3 occasions, Democratic Unionist Party have threatened the political institutions if they don't get their own way. The first time was around the issue of the on the runs. The second, in response to the Parades Commission's decision to restrict the Orange Parade in the Crumlin Road. And the third, on the issue of welfare cuts. But I believe that the real threat to the political institutions is stagnation and the failure, specific failure of the British government to underpin the equality ethos of the Good Friday Agreement. Secret meetings with the DUP in Downing Street are absolutely no substitute whatsoever for a meaningful, inclusive process involving all of the political parties to face up to all of the challenges that are before us. And if the purpose of that is, in the context of the outcome of the next British general election next year, to try to curry favour with the DUP in relation to the prospect of going back into government, then they do a real disservice to a peace process that is held up internationally as a beacon of hope for many, many others. The retreat of political unionism from dialogue, compromise, agreement and reconciliation, for me anyway, is bitterly disappointing. I say that because I respect the right of unionists to hold dear their political beliefs and traditions. But unionists should also be willing to accept that in a peace process of this nature, a real spirit of generosity is required from everyone. Republicans have recognised that agreement and compromise is about building a better future for all of our people. And that we are determined to do. It's about reconciliation and learning to live with our different political perspectives and beliefs. I have personally tried to understand and reach out to the unionist population, not least in my engagement with someone that they hold dear, with Queen Elizabeth. But reconciliation is not a one-way street. Unionist leaders need to engage in similar initiatives. They need, in a genuine spirit of generosity, to reach out to the Republican and nationalist traditions and to the new and diverse communities that increasingly make up our modern society. So there is enormous onus on those who recognise the enormous progress that we have made, and indeed continue to make since the IRA cessation in 1994, to make their voices heard. The obvious goodwill and support for partnership government and for a shared future which exists needs to manifest itself much more tangibly right across civic society and in the north of Ireland. And the supporters of the agreement internationally, in particular the United States of America, need to reassert their interest and influence. And that's why this week I welcomed the visit of Senator Gary Hart on behalf of Secretary of State Kerry in terms of meeting with all of the political parties to assess where things are at. But in all of this, the two governments also have a duty to act decisively in defence of the new political dispensation. A central pillar of the peace process has been the involvement of the US administration at times of difficulty and the role of the two governments acting jointly as guarantors of the process. The two governments must now act decisively to uphold and fulfil their obligations. The two governments need to be champions for progress, not as they have been over the recent past, facilitators of inertia. The negative anti-agreement axis must understand that there will be no return to the past, that the days of one-party rule, of domination and repression are over and will never return. There needs to be a renewed focus by those who support the agreement. These are the challenges for all of us as we enter a new term in the Assembly, but I am determined to find a resolution to all the difficulties facing the political process. This will require focus, attention and patience, but through genuine engagement by all parties and a hands-on approach by the British and Irish governments, I believe progress can be made. Dialogue and agreement brings with it many challenges, as many people in this room know. That is one of the obvious lessons of the last 20 years. The reality is that there is no alternative to dialogue, and there is no alternative to agreement. And I believe that this is the only path to a shared and better future on this island. So, as the media record this historic anniversary of what was indeed a game-changing decision by the IRA leadership, I believe that we in this room can be very proud of the massive contribution that we as Irish Republicans, who absolutely believe in the freedom of our country, absolutely hold dear our primary political objective of the reunification of our country, but by purely peaceful and democratic means. I think that our contribution, your contribution, and the support that we have received from the overwhelming majority of Republicans is something to be very, very proud of. I was very honoured and very proud to be elected as an MP in the Mid-Ulster constituency in 1997. And within a month of being elected, I led a Sinn Féin delegation to South Africa at an invitation of Nelson Mandela, which went to all of the other political parties. At that time, unionist political leaders refused to travel in the same airplane as us. And when we got to South Africa, they also refused to travel in the same airplane to the final destination. And we ended up in a twin-engine Cessna, 4 of us, myself, Jerry Kelly, Rita O'Hare, and the late and great Siobhan O'Hanlon. And when we were in the place where the talks were supposed to take place, they decided to give us a break, and they had a big bus to take us to the southernmost tip of Africa. And you can guess what happened there. We got a minibus. But there was a hamper at the back of the minibus, and Ali Musa, who was the Minister for Local Government, was a bit fed up by all of this. And he went to the back of the minibus and took out a bottle of Irish whiskey and poured himself a glass and raised it to the sky and said, "Up the Republic." But that shows you how things have changed. And it shows all of us in this room how our contribution has brought about that change. Even though it's a change that many of us think is going too slowly. At times people can get frustrated and can get fed up at the activities of our, I suppose, colleagues in government. But there's no stopping change. It'll either go fast or it'll go slow. But there's no stopping it. And we are at the heart of it, and we don't intend to stop. We intend to continue on, to build a better future for our young people. And this city is, I think, a fantastic example of how things have changed. Even though it is a city that's still faced into all sorts of challenges in terms of the employment front and so forth. But if you look at the last couple of years and the ability of everybody in this city, Catholic, Protestant, dissenters, all political parties, law and orders, business community, to come together to resolve the parading issue, for example, to bring about great initiatives which usually benefit our people. This city stands as a beacon of hope. This city does stand as an example to others. The others don't like me saying that. Just as, you know, as I mentioned in a BBC interview in the course of the last while, I've met Queen Elizabeth on 3 occasions. Not one unionist politician, has said to me when they met me in the aftermath of those 3 engagements that that was a good thing to do. And that sets you thinking. It sets me thinking back to 20 years ago when the IRA announced the ceasefire. The leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, James Mulligan, what did he say? He said that the IRA ceasefire was the most destabilising event since partition. So, we are wedded to peace. Many people in this room has suffered greatly as a result of conflict. Many people have lost loved ones. And we're very determined that that never happens again. We're very, very determined to continue on in spite of all the challenges and all the problems. I think we've come up to the mark. I think that we have bent over backwards to make this peace process work. It's now time for others, including the governments, to bend over backwards to ensure the continuation of this process. We're a leader, my order.